Hello and welcome to Talk the Walk. I'm Raymond Yang. With us tonight is Chief Executive Carrie Lam, who just delivered her fourth policy address. Mrs. Lam, thank you for coming on to the show.
Pleasure.
So for those of you who've just been following the news, so Mrs. Lam has delivered her fourth policy address in which there are about 200 or so initiatives for Hong Kongers. And so critics have been saying that you have 200 or so initiatives, but none stands out. So is this perception fair, you think?
Hong Kong is a very diverse city with a lot of differences in opinions. I have heard many comments on this policy address over the last 2 days. Yes, some said that it is rather piecemeal. There's a lot of initiatives, but no focus, as you have just pointed out. But some said that it has a very clear focus on integration with the mainland and on the Greater Bay Area. So I would say that this policy address aims to both revive Hong Kong's economy, not only in the short to medium term, but in the longer term, but at the same time tries very much to address some of the underlying difficulties that we have, for example, in housing and land, for example, in youth employment, for example, in how we sort of address some of the problems in education.
So apart from all these new measures that you proposed for Hong Kong for the coming year, so I think Executive Councillor Regina Ip said she was pleasantly surprised to see the withdrawal of 14 directorate-level posts from the Finance Committee. So that, I think, would save the government, the public coffers, about $29 million a year. So, and then people would naturally ask, so are these posts really necessary from the beginning then?
Well, these posts are necessary. The creation of every senior post in the civil service, which we call directorate positions, for example, at the assistant director level and at the principal assistant secretary level, each post creation has to go through a very vigorous process of scrutiny by the financial side and also by the civil service management side, because we always have a policy to contain the size of the civil service establishment. Many of these posts actually were proposed not today. As you remember, our Legislative Council has been malfunctioning for a very long time. So some of these posts were carried over from a previous period. But having heard the concerns of the Legislative Council members, especially since the beginning of this term in mid-October, which we have a more rational forum in the Legislative Council, I took the view that, yes, members are concerned that when outside of the civil service, we are facing some job losses. People are suffering from reduction in wages, but the civil service is generally very well protected. There is security of tenure. So could you people work harder during a difficult period instead of just business as usual, coming back for more staffing, for more work? I wouldn't say that they are unnecessary. Each post is necessary, but we are in a very different and difficult situation. So one is I accept the concerns of the members that we better more positively respond to the current economic and employment situation in Hong Kong. And secondly is I want to demonstrate that as long as we have rational interaction in the Legislative Council, the government is always prepared to listen and to take on board members' advice. So what I have decided and reflected in the policy address is I have withdrawn all the items. It's actually more than 14, because some are already in the queue. They have not appeared on the agenda, but they are on the queue. So I have withdrawn all the items and require the relevant departments to individually scrutinize each and every, and then to go through a process to be vetted by the Secretary for the Civil Service. And if each and every post is still considered justified, and they have really to be very well justified, then they could only be created on a temporary position.
Okay, but then the withdrawal of these funding requests at the Finance Committee also gave rise to some conspiracy theories that you're paving the way for this preliminary funding or the surveying request for the Lantau Tomorrow Vision project. So I want to touch on this as well. So you also said in your policy address that you would not give up this very controversial long-term reclamation plan. But then last year in your policy address, you also cited the land resumption ordinance in saying that the government will try harder to resume land in Northern New Territories, taking back the brownfield sites and farmland. And some land rights groups are saying, like, why aren't you going back to this initiative rather than pushing ahead with the reclamation?
Well, first is I have acknowledged and reflected in several of my policy addresses that housing is the biggest social issue in Hong Kong. And I have elaborated on the uniqueness of this housing problem in the 2020 policy address by elaborating that for the grassroots families, subsidized housing is a very significant poverty alleviation measure. If we can give them decent housing, then they can be on their own. But if they are suffering from heavy rents and living in very poor conditions, then it will continue to damage the opportunities of this family to move up. And for the middle income family, owning a home is a sense of belonging in this place. And for society at large, housing is not just a supply issue, it's also an equity and justice issue, because it's a very important piece of asset. So for those who have not, then society becomes very polarized. And finally, for governance, I said that if I could if any CE or any government could not resolve the housing issue, then you could not have peace on a long-term basis, because people will still dislike the government and have a lot of grievances. So that is the backdrop of my housing and land policy. Now, coming to land, we have been adopting an approach of leaving no stones unturned. So all the measures that you have mentioned, the critics have mentioned, have been adopted in these few years. Whether it's land resumption, whether it is a rezoning of existing land, or even reclaiming part of the Fanning Golf Course. They're all part of this multi-pronged approach. But all this will be able to solve the problems for the short term. For example, this time I've announced that for the first time in the long-term housing strategy, we have found all the land for a 10-year production, which is 360,000. But beyond this 10-year, beyond the 10-year, I still managed to find land, about 100,000 units for the 10th to the 15th year. But what about beyond the 15th year? By 2035, land will be more or less exhausted. So we need to start planning for that long-term supply of land. And reclamation, especially artificial islands, require a long lead time, because I need to put in all this transport and rail infrastructure before we could build housing and accommodate people. So I said that unless we don't want a solution for the longer term, otherwise we have to start today to implement this long-term option. I just want to come back to your earlier point. There's no conspiracy whatsoever, because to be very honest, with the current Legislative Council, which is more rational, which is willing to take into account the broader interests, then it's a matter of time. We can put this item in the queue. The preceding items could be discussed within a few meetings, then we will still come to the land tile or the artificial islands funding item. So I just want to make it very clear that the withdrawal of the earlier agenda items is entirely because we want to respond to the members' concern.
I think you also touched on a very interesting viewpoint, which is there would be no peace in Hong Kong if the government or you cannot solve the housing crisis. So, and then people, mostly critics, have said that you did not try hard enough to mend the rift between the government, the administration, and the broad Hong Kong public, who felt the government has not been doing enough to listen to their voices over the past year or so. And so this is mending the rift. But you also mentioned some new measures, such as asking teenagers to admit guilt so they would be bound over. So these measures, so they would not be put to prison. But then is this a way of the government to mend the rift with the young people?
Well, coming back to that particular reference in the policy address about how to deal with the minors, that is those under 18 who have been arrested for involvement in this violence and confrontations and whatsoever. When I discussed this with the Secretary for Security and the Commissioner of Police, our objective is really, we were heartbroken. So young people, why would they breach the law? What is their state of mind when they did this? So we all want to give them a chance, because if they were convicted, then they will have a criminal record. And for students to have a criminal record at this early stage, it will affect their future. For example, if they want to go abroad to study. So what the CP and myself and Secretary for Security agreed is, as long as they are willing to admit the guilt, which is the basis for the superintendent's scheme, and also for the bind over, then depending on the circumstances and if the crime involved is not a particularly serious one, then we would try to use this alternative to the criminal prosecution. This is out of compassion and care and love for the young people. I will not arbitrarily say that this is something to mend the rift and so on. But coming back to your point about mending the rift, I think the first thing we need to answer is, what is the cause of this rift? If the cause of this rift is the government is not performing good enough, then we will work very hard to listen to the people, to engage the people, to improve governance. If the cause of a rift is not supporting the one country, two system, is trying to advocate for independence of Hong Kong, or even to bring in external governments and external forces to damage Hong Kong's interest, then I'm sorry, it's not for the CE to acquiesce to those demands in order to mend the so-called rift. So principles are very important. And that's why I know that there will be critics about my including a dedicated chapter on one country, two systems in a policy address. And this has proven to be right. They said that I'm a puppet of the central government, and my whole intention is to appease the central government. That is not the purpose. The purpose is to set the bottom line, to make very clear the principles that will enable Hong Kong to flourish and maintain stability now and into the future.
Okay, I'll have to stop you right here at the moment. So we'll be back for Talk the Walk. Stay with us.